Well, great. Good morning. My name is Helene von Bismarck. I'm a German historian who thinks about Britain all day long, and I'm very pleased to be here for this workshop. And I'm supposed to chair the first session about how do the English, as possibly opposed to the British, view the world. And then later we're going to turn the perspective around in the second panel and talk about how the world, or different parts of the world, view England. We have 4 different papers today. First will be Professor John Denham, who and his PhD student.
Well, he's not mine, but he's a PhD student.
Yeah,
So
okay.
yes, I just borrowed him to understand the maths.
And who I think is joining
online.
Yes,
Yeah.
from the University of Southampton. Then we have Nick Pearce from Bath University, who used to be a Downing Street advisor and head of the IPPR think tank. And then we have Baroness Julie Smith, who is a Liberal Democrat peer in the House of Lords and a lecturer at the University of Cambridge. So, John, why don't you
Okay,
get
thanks.
started?
Do I have control of the slides, Tim? Yeah, okay. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Okay, let me start. Right, let me just set the scene for this session, in which I'm going to present a bit of survey work that we did in England and Scotland, because the money didn't stretch any further, although we would have liked to have done it in all 4 parts of the United Kingdom, on attitudes towards foreign policy. The background to this is quite straightforward, but we're trying to highlight something that is often obscured. The first point is that England, in many ways, shapes United Kingdom foreign policy. It does it because it's by far the largest part of the United Kingdom, but it also does it because the electoral system in particular has, over the last 40 to 50 years, produced governments of the United Kingdom that have very clearly been popular governments in England, but not necessarily so in Wales or Scotland, and certainly the same party is not represented at all in Northern Ireland. And even if, not getting ahead of the polls, the next election was to produce a UK government that was more balanced across England, Scotland and Wales, that's not obvious that that will change the way in which foreign policy is seen, because UK governments and government decision-making often share an Anglo-centric view of the British Union, which tends to equate views of Britain with those of England. Evidenced, as I said in my note, that I see that the Labour Party in the current election campaigns confidently with a Union Jack in England, but doesn't do so in Wales and Scotland, suggesting that Labour finds it easy to think of England and Britain as the same, but is much more reluctant to see the other parts of the United Kingdom as parts of Britain, even though they are Britain. So that's the background. The second bit of background was quite simply that Brexit, the biggest disruption in UK foreign policy for many, many years, was predominantly an England decision. The weight of votes came from England, but particularly within England, those who emphasised their English identity. So part of the background work that Tim and I have done was just to explore whether there are echoes of that are still in the system, whether there are other issues lurking that might disrupt UK foreign policy, and particularly because of the impact that Brexit had not just on the UK, but on relations within the United Kingdom, particularly in relation to Scotland and Northern Ireland. Are there other things with consequences for the Union? So what we're going to talk about very briefly is 2 different surveys. The first, quite a simple one, exploring in England and Scotland. They weren't quite contemporaneous, so we need to take that into account. But England and Scotland, very simple attitudes towards those parts of the world with whom relationships were seen as most important, attitudes on questions of trade, attitudes on questions of defence and security. The second survey, which Connor will talk about, was a much more comprehensive survey, something like 28 questions, much more trying to get to underlying attitudes to foreign policy issues, and that was also conducted at the same time in England and Scotland. So let me start by just talking about the first survey, This is the simple one which asked about relationships, trade and defence. We asked people essentially to what extent they agreed with certain statements and how strongly they agreed with those statements. So it wasn't asking people to choose between different statements. And in this survey, we asked people about their national identity on the Merino scale that goes from English not British through more English than British through to British not English. There are many ways we could have looked at the underlying data, of course, but we did this because in the Brexit referendum, whether you emphasised your English identity or British identity was a significant indicator of how you would vote in England, with the English people more likely to vote Remain, but also in Scotland, where it was British emphasisers who tended to vote Leave and Scottish identifiers who tended to vote Remain. So it seemed reasonable to ask about national identity. What we also did with some of this was we picked out those people who expressed a positive view on various statements. It cuts out some of the noise from the very large number of people who don't have particularly strong views on foreign policy. These are the overall averages from England and Scotland. What you see is that England prioritises US relationships more than Scotland, Scotland more than China. We won't try to discuss all the implications of what we're saying. Some of you might see in this an English favouring of the Anglosphere compared with Scotland. Others might think that's a bit tentative. There was very little difference on average between England and Scotland on trade or defence. So I'll go through these by nation. So in terms of relationships, what I think stands out here in England is there's a much greater spread of views on the EU and the importance of the EU in future relationships than there is in Scotland. And these are very clearly separated out by national identity to a extent that is less so in Scotland. So there's some evidence of some worldview there. Second, a general point about all this survey. In England, the national identity group is a fairly linear scale from the people who are English, not British, through to the people who are more British than English. And funnily enough, the British, not English, tend to move back the other direction slightly in the scale, which we see a lot of this polling. In Scotland, that is much less consistent. That there are quite a few issues on which the Scottish, not British, hold one position, and the more Scottish than British are the other hold. So national identities are more of a predictor of position in England than in Scotland. The next one we looked at was trade by national identity. So the priorities people took to reducing EU trade barriers, global trade barriers, but we also asked what sort of priority should go on to national resilience as a matter of economic policy, and secondly, resisting foreign ownership of business and services. And this again, I think is quite interesting. No time to think about the implications. There's a greater spread within England on the importance of reducing trade barriers than there is in Scotland, where there's pretty much a consensus there. Interestingly enough, there's a bigger spread in Scotland on attitudes towards global trade barriers, so it's less of a consensus position. The other thing to highlight, though, is the extent to which all identity groups in both nations prioritise a politics of national resilience when it comes to economic and trade policy. And the third area, just to mention on briefly, is defence by national identity. And here you get quite distinctly different shaped lozenges of opinion. In England, the more British groups are much more positive about aid than are the more English groups. In Scotland, it's a similar spread. There's also greater diversity of view about alliances and their importance in foreign policy. Just to mention, none of the groups in either nation are keen to see military action used to extend human rights and democracy, which is itself quite interesting, I think, and not necessarily what we expected. Instead, people in most groups tend to prioritise military action around national defence only. So, no time to draw out the implications, but just to say that when we do look at simple attitudes on foreign policy questions and England and Scotland, you get some differences between the two nations, but you also get some significant differences by people's sense of national identity in those two nations. Now, I'm going to leave that there and say hello to Connor and let Tim work out technology so that you can see Connor as well. But who's going to talk about the second survey? Connor, you can not see now.
Okay, I'll just share my slide.
Yes, yeah. So move on to the next one.
It's gone. Oh.
Right. Okay, Connor.
Should I share my slides, or are we just going to work off the slides that are already?
Tell me when you want to move the slide along, and I'll move it along.
Okay. Yeah. So
We make
for
it a
my
little bit louder.
can everybody hear me?
That's
Yeah.
Yeah, so for my piece of analysis, working with John, we talked about how we could potentially segment the population into maybe a cluster of 4 or 5 groups of like connected worldviews based on the larger survey of 28 questions across multiple different dimensions around security, the EU, trade, etc. So that's what I've been working on. So if you skip to the next slide. So I did attempt to initially segment the population into these clusters based on different questions around the EU, America, security, trade, China, culture, etc. And the analysis failed to produce a clearly distinct set of clustered worldviews, primarily because there's just so much variation and noise in the data set that it's quite hard to distinctively cluster people. But what I did identify is that although you can't clearly segment the population, there does appear to be some underlying connections between these different areas of UK foreign policy. So if you skip to the next slide. So these two correlation plots for England and Scotland show where there's basically some levels of correlation between attitudes to different questions that we asked. So just to pick out a few, we noticed, for example, that positive attitudes towards the UK having its own nuclear weapons is also positively associated with the belief that the UK should not take more action on climate change than other countries. So there is a connection, for example, between security and climate change. We also found, for example, that the belief that the UK best succeeds as a sovereign trading nation is actually negatively associated with the belief that the UK's imperial history weakens its position in the world. So there's different areas where you can connect people's opinions, and there does appear to be some kind of underlying dimensions within the data set. So if you skip to the next slide. So what I essentially try to do instead, if anyone's ever done something called dimensionality reduction, which is like principal components analysis, I essentially reduce down all the different answers to all these different questions to a smaller set of primary dimensions using something called correspondence analysis. And what it essentially does is it shows the kind of visually the connections between different questions that we asked. And we identified 3 primary axes of foreign policy attitudes, which explains almost half of all the responses in the data set in both countries. So these 3 dimensions that you kind of have to infer for yourself. But the first one we identified was kind of sovereignty. So this explains attitudes towards nuclear weapons, the UK's relationship with the EU, the UK as a sovereign trading nation, and also the UK's action on climate change. The second dimension we identified was primarily Atlanticism. So this is just people's attitudes towards the USA and the UK's relationship with the USA. And then finally, the third one, which was a little bit harder to kind of understand, but we've kind of called it broadly the UK and the world. This explains attitudes towards things like free trade, market economics, Britain's imperialistic history, also climate change, and then also Britain's relationship with NATO and also the war in Ukraine. So if we skip to the next slide. If you then plot respondents along these the first 2 primary dimensions, you can kind of see already the kind of leave remain spread along primarily the first dimension. So unsurprisingly, leavers show much higher levels of sovereignty on average than remainers. And then if you then segment it along the second dimension, which is Atlanticism, interestingly, you see a little bit more of a split even within leavers and remainers. So for example, among leavers who are primarily more sovereigntist in their attitude, there is actually some discrepancy between those who are more pro-Atlanticist and those who are more anti-Atlanticist. So we skip to the next slide. So just interestingly then to look at the first dimension, sovereignty, if we split that by the Moreno scale, for example, you see in England that those who identify as English and not British demonstrate the highest levels of sovereigntist sentiment, and it kind of declines at every level to where British, not English, demonstrate lower levels of sovereigntist attitude on average. But interestingly, in Scotland, you see that reverse effect. So those who identify as Scottish and not British are the least sort of sovereigntist in their attitudes, which then inclines upwards to those who are British and not Scottish, who show higher levels of sovereigntist sentiment. So you see this kind of reflection, the kind of inverse effect in England and Scotland between the Moreno scale, which is interesting. I think this jumps back to John.
Okay, Connor, thank you very much indeed. I'd say to everybody in the group, we covered a huge amount of ground very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Because I'm aware that there are people in the room who spend their life doing this sort of political science data analysis, and there are people who don't spend any of their life doing this. It's quite hard to. So what essentially wanted to do was to share some broad headline issues, not to expect people to engage with in detail. For people who really want to get into the detail of this stuff, Connor in particular, who's had to hold my hand through this, will be willing to talk it through. But let me just wrap up a few last things and then draw out what I think or we think might be some of the questions to think about. And also people who actually really do get into the data would be very happy to talk afterwards about maybe other ways we could have looked at the data and other ways we could have questioned it. One of the things I should have stressed, which came out very strongly from what Connor said, was the current position of people who voted Leave Remain in 2016. So I need to stress, this actually was a serendipitous byproduct of the fact that we were using the YouGov polling panel. So they know how people voted in 2016. So this is not people who have described themselves as Leavers and Remainers today. It doesn't tell us anything about how their attitude to whether we should be in the EU has worked out or where Brexit has worked or not. This is the group of people back in 2016, actually we find still have, whatever their views on the EU today, distinctly different worldviews and some distance apart on quite a number of different questions. So although we weren't able to do a sort of proper scientific segmentation of issues, there's something significant there in the woodwork. So just running through this, when we looked at the earlier types of plots, I showed you on the simple questions and used the same Leave Remain data. Again, you see very different footprints in both England and Scotland between Leavers and Remainers. Perhaps interesting, you could argue that in Scotland, the divergence is almost entirely on the EU, whereas in England, it's a much different shape with more of an emphasis amongst Leavers on the Commonwealth and Australia, less engagement with India, China and the EU. Again, questioned, is that a sort of Anglosphere attitude beginning to come out amongst Leavers that is not there amongst Remainers and is less evident in Scotland? I raised it as a question, not as a conclusion. Secondly, on trade, again, different shaped lozenges. The Leavers much more emphasis on protecting British business and British services from foreign ownership in both groups. The gap around the importance of EU trade barriers far bigger amongst England's Remain Leave community divide than in Scotland. And possibly the biggest difference at all on the defence comes security issues, where you can absolutely see that the Remain voters are much more positive about foreign aid in both communities. English Leavers, but also Scottish Leavers, much more wanting to restrict military action to resisting direct threat to the nation. They are the least enthusiastic about using military action for human rights, democracy issues, but none of the communities are particularly keen. on doing that. Similar positions. And the final thing that you'll want to look at, because they're in the papers we sent out to you, what Connor did was map the differences in attitudes from the bigger survey by the Leave Remain divide. So you see, and I'll probably just do the England one, huge difference on England's position as a sovereign trading nation on alignment with the EU, positive attitudes towards the EU as a force for good in the world, but also a very big divide on whether this country should go, or England, the UK should go further than other countries on climate change. That's the fourth most important bit on this divide. A big divide on the priority of economic issues over humanitarian issues, going down to quite a substantial divide on nuclear weapons. And in Scotland, similar sort of patterns, but I think nuclear weapons appears rather further up the list there. So that's loads and loads of data and things to think about. All the questions, if you want to look at them in detail, are in the packs that we sent to you. Let me just pick out a few things in reflecting on this. We might have found more correlations had we thought of small boats and asylum as foreign policy issues, which we didn't include in the survey, and with retrospect rather wish we had, because that probably would have brought up a relevant idea. Where is there potential for issues to become divisive, either within the UK and England in particular as its largest part, or between England and Scotland? Attitudes towards the EU, attitudes toward the USA, foreign aid, ownership of nuclear weapons, climate change, possibly military action. All of these are areas where there's both a wide spread of views and quite a polarization of views. It's also worth saying that there's, if you stop, because we started the exercise looking at division, and sometimes you have to stand back from it and say, where wasn't there division? One of the things I would say is that there's quite a high priority amongst all voters on national economic resilience, on international action to tackle international companies, and a lack of enthusiasm for action on human rights. And that's quite interesting, because some of the precepts of UK foreign policy for the past 30 years have been in various order: globalization, liberal interventionism, neoliberalism, Atlanticism, and Gaius alone trading nations. And if you actually test those propositions of UK foreign policy against where the people are, there's not a huge sign up for any of those. The final point to end is this, and it should, I hope, be part of the discussion in this session and later on. None of this matters unless contingent events make them important. So in other words, you could map English Euroscepticism a good decade before we knew we were going to have an EU referendum. And it was in the system and it didn't seem to matter. It only mattered when both the combination of the sovereign question of Brexit and immigration came together at the time of the referendum. And if we look at where these issues have entered the political system, they've either been through elections, through referendum, through the initiative of disruptive political parties, as Farage is doing with reform at the moment, or the positions taken by legitimate devolved elected bodies, which have highlighted differences in attitudes, as of course happened after the Brexit referendum over the Internal Market Act and things of that sort. So part of our discussion perhaps is not just about public attitudes, but what are the circumstances in which any of these issues might come to be important. And probably for the last session today, what does this say about territorial management of foreign policy within the United Kingdom, particularly when territorial foreign policy is usually assumed to be England's foreign policy and not something that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have got much of a say on. So if we want to avoid some of the events of recent years, do we need to manage the territorial discussion of foreign policy differently? Thank you for your patience in bearing which is like a 3-day conference worth of material. But this is the start of the process for Tim, myself, and Connor. So I hope we can come back to some of these issues in due course. Thanks, Elaine.
Well, thank you. I think what we're going to do, we're listening to all the papers first, and then we move it to the discussion, so everybody gets an equal share of time. So Nick Pierce will go next.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Good. Well, thanks very much, John. And Connor, that was it's really interesting. And I think this question of the territorial politics of foreign policy is under-researched and very important. I just want to make a few points in response to the themes that John has raised, and in particular the one that you ended with, John, on the question of the relationship between public attitudes and public opinion and contingent political events and political strategies, how those attitudes are mobilised for particular political projects. And the first point I think to make is that in major political projects in our history have combined both the external and the domestic. They have sought to prosecute objectives for domestic policy and domestic political advantage or electoral advantage alongside external positions. So tariff reform, which split Edwardian politics and dominated conservative politics well into the 20th century, combined both a perspective on England and the empire and its role, the role of tariffs in cementing particularly the white settler colonies, the dominions of empire, with a project of social reform. Tariffs would pay for pensions, they would pay for meeting the social demands of the newly enfranchised working class communities. Brexit's the same. Left-wing supporters of Brexit supported it because it would enable, or apparently enable, more public ownership, state intervention in the economy, state aid. Ditto those on the Thatcherite right of the Eurosceptic Leave camp, wishing to see Brexit enable the kind of completion of the deregulation of the British economy, Thatcherite liberalisation and so on. So that has been characteristic of major political projects, to link the domestic and the external, and that's something I think that we come back to. John mentioned immigration, we'll talk about that perhaps a bit more. On the Anglosphere, and this is a very good example, the Anglosphere was certainly a project of English conservatives, drawing on the attitudes and the sort of sense of kith and kin familiarity which John pointed to in the data that there seems to be amongst the English, and very much developed within the sort of peripatetic networks of English conservatives in the Anglosphere itself, amongst political parties of the right in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK and America, and constructing an alternative place for Britain in the world outside the European Union. So saying if we leave the European Union, there is a natural place for us, there is a natural set of alliances, the Five Eyes alliances for defence, foreign, security policy and trade, which is the Anglosphere. And that was very much a project led by English conservatives, no question about that. They're an example of how some of those differences in public attitudes that John pointed to might be sort of mobilised in the service of a bigger political project on worldview of Britain's place in the world. Just on some other questions then of the relationship between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I think here, I mean certainly historically there have been relations which are geographic and geopolitical in nature between England, Scotland and Northern Ireland in particular. Historically, Ireland and Scotland were seen as a vulnerability for England, a backdoor to England for French and Spanish forces. That lasted well into the 18th century for after the Act of Union, the Jacobite rebellions, for England's relationship to Scotland, and with the Irish, of course, it was the main reason for the Act of Union in 1801. The Irish Republican rebellions in the late 18th century, and that sense of strategic defence vulnerability posed by the periphery for England certainly persisted in respect of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as it was formed through the 20th century, the treaty ports, for example, that remained within the British Empire when the Irish Free State was founded, 2 in the south and 1 in the north, a source of tension in the 1930s, the protection of Atlantic convoys and so on in the Second World War. And you see today, very interestingly, English Conservatives attacking the Republic of Ireland for free riding on NATO and for exposing England and the rest of the United Kingdom to vulnerabilities from the Russians in particular. Policy Exchange published a couple of reports on this, arguing that Irish neutrality free rides on NATO and exposes the UK. A different but separate issue related to Scotland, John mentioned attitudes to nuclear weapons. A big issue for British policymakers in the run-up to the Scottish referendum was preparing for the case in which Scotland became independent, what would happen to the Falzane nuclear base, that you know, being a very important strategic base for British defence. And of course, the Scottish National Party is an anti-nuclear party and takes a different perspective on these issues, and that is reflected in the data. Yeah, so we see that we see Scottish voters being far less committed to nuclear defence. I think on other questions, divides within the populations of England and Scotland and Northern Ireland are more significant perhaps than divides between them. So attitudes to the issues that John raised, attitudes to overseas aid, whether we stay in the European Convention on Human Rights, attitudes to Gaza, the conflict in Gaza, are structured by age primarily. As was the Leave Remain vote. Leavers were older voters. There was a cross-class coalition of older voters, and we see that in attitudes to issues like Gaza as well, overseas aid and others that John has talked about. There is more of a pro-Palestinian perspective amongst Scottish voters in the data, and that perhaps in part reflects the Irish Catholic heritage of many Scottish voters and within political elites, a much more sympathetic position in respect of the Palestinians than you find in English politics. But for the most part, the biggest divides are not actually between the territories, but they are on the basis of characteristics of voters, particularly their age. The final point is just on this question of multiculturalism and foreign policy that John raised at the end, or at least attitudes to immigration. Because you can clearly see now in contemporary discussion an attempt to link attitudes to immigration, attitudes to things like the Gaza conflict, and multiculturalism, and an attempt to make illegitimate, unpatriotic the attitudes of particularly Muslim voters to those questions, their connections and and views on foreign policy issues being rendered illegitimate by those that oppose immigration, that are increasingly Islamophobic and have in their project a desire to link those sort of foreign policy positions taken by sections of the British public with their identities and belongings. So, you know, we've traditionally thought of multiculturalism and foreign policy as being an issue of diasporas and diasporic links. And some of those sorts of questions. Actually, I think it's very different now. It's not simply about those diasporic issues that pertain to particular communities. It is much more about the linking of insiders and outsiders, and foreign policy being used to be part of a cluster of issues which render certain populations illegitimate or attempt to render certain populations illegitimate, and certain stances on immigration more or otherwise patriotic. And that would take us then to the kind of question of Englishness, because those links have been mobilised in the past. So those are my thoughts. Very interesting, important work, and perhaps these are some areas in which it might be developed.
Oh, that was fascinating, thank you, and very sort of timely, but I was really intrigued by your last point, because if I understand you correctly, then culture or religious background or ethnic background turns into, or foreign policy then turns into a stick to beat minorities with politically, which is actually very worrying, I would argue. So I think this is worth sort of elaborating maybe in the discussion. Yeah. But first we'll hear the next paper by Nicholas Scott, who is a PhD student at King's, and who's working, his PhD is on English identity, as he told me, in young people post-Brexit.
Hello everyone, yeah, I'm Nicholas Scott or Nick Scott. Usually only my mother calls me Nicholas when she's annoyed with me, so let's go with Nick. But yeah, so I'm presenting a little tidbit of information regarding my PhD project, which is ongoing right now. So I don't have nearly as much depth of data as John does, and my study is mainly qualitative as well, so it's more to do with subjective viewpoints, opinions, and identity in young people post-Brexit, as Tim just said. So the panel questions that were posed by Tim are as follows, and my research strongly pertains to question number 3 with regards to the panel questions. So again, is there an English worldview and does it differ from a British worldview? That's good. So this is my PhD research project. It's titled Rethinking English, British, and European Identities After Brexit, an analysis of new identifiers in post-Brexit England. So the central research question I seek to ask is how has Brexit changed the way young, so I say young being 18 to 30, English people conceptualize the relationship between English, British, and European identities and post-Brexit England. I'm interested in young people predominantly because they're going to shape the future relationship between the UK and the EU, as well as between the 4 home nations. And also being 28, I actually fall in that category, so I can consider myself young still, which is also nice. So in regards to theory and methodology, I frame most of my work within the modernist constructivist school of identity studies, which looks at identity, so national identity, personal identity, any kind of subjective identity that one holds, as a modern political phenomenon that's kind of being created through things such as shared education and culture and other institutions. I also use post-functionalism, which is this theory of European integration that argues as identity issues become more politicized with regards to things such as European integration, usually things will then affect, I guess, political realities. So post-functionalism looks at identity and how identities become politicized in the UK as one of the foundational reasons as to why Brexit happened. And then the most interesting aspect of my research, which is called Q methodology at the bottom, is my data collection and retention method, which I'll delve into more in depth. So this is Q method. I didn't bring my research materials with me, but Q method is a mixed method, qualitative and quantitative research methodology, which uses a set of 43 statements in my case, but it can be anywhere from 40 to 250, though I thought 250 was too broad, that reflect a certain issue. So the issue I'm seeking participants to answer is how has Brexit affected your identity? So participants are given a set of 43 statements. They're tasked with putting the statements into 3 piles, whether they agree with the statement, disagree with the statement, or don't know. After they have those 3 sets of piles, they will then start with usually one of the polls. I find it's easier to do that. And they'll slowly place the statements on the board, again, with how, I guess, polarizing those statements make them feel. So I'll show you the statements to make more sense of this. These are the statements. I apologize for the smallness of the text, but as you can see, they're supposed to be mainly objective, I would say. So the first statement says, I feel English. The second says, I feel European. If you go down the list to say 25, a person's loyalty, devotion should be to the nation first. You go to 38, England has more in common with the Commonwealth than Europe. So these statements are, again, sorted by the participant in those 3 piles, then placed on the board. After the statements are placed on the board, the participant is allowed to finalize their selection, move things around until their overall viewpoint on the issue is, I guess, made more apparent. And after that, what I do is I input this into a factor analysis software, which finds commonalities between the way each individual participant has arranged the statements vis-a-vis every other participant. So what that's supposed to do is at least, hopefully, show how these statements reflect more broadly held beliefs in English society, specifically young people, on Brexit and how it's affected their identity. So I'm just going to go quickly over one individual participant from the University of Liverpool, which David, who's in the back room, actually helped set up for my visit to the campus. So thank you for that. I wouldn't even be able to do this presentation without him. So this individual selected these 3 statements as the statements they most agreed with. So statement 1, English identity and European identity are compatible. Second statement, England should have a devolved government responsible for English affairs. And then finally, I would vote rejoining if there was a new referendum on EU membership. So after the participants have done their statements and they put them all out onto the board, they then are asked to explain why they selected the 3 statements in the most agree column and the 3 statements in the most disagree column. So you can see here, for English identity and European identity are compatible. The respondent said, I believe that identity is most composite in the sense that I'm from Merseyside, English, British, and European. These identities don't compete. My European identity is a more normative one. For statement 42, I would vote to rejoin if there was a new referendum on EU membership. They say Brexit has been a political and economic disaster, and they would immediately rejoin the EU. And then finally, for statement 29, England should have a devolved government for English affairs. They believe federalism would deliver power to local people in a better way. So then we move on to the ones they most disagreed with. So they have England is better off out of the EU. England and the UK should no longer be viewed as European after leaving the EU. And finally, my identity is English, not British or European. So for part 2, England's better off out of the EU. The benefits of the EU membership were profound, so they fundamentally disagree with that statement. My identity is English, not British or European. So they say their identities aren't exclusive and they can identify as all three, which is important for the next bit, which we'll discuss in a second. And finally, England and the UK should no longer be viewed as European after leaving the EU. So they say this is more an objective reality. England and the UK more broadly are on the continent of Europe, even though they're an island nation, which is another aspect of English identity, British identity. But it says we are European. So what you can do from here is build identity typologies. So what I've done is I've taken those most agree, most disagree statements. Again, mind you, this is just one individual. So with more data, I can build, I guess, greater personalities within English society. But the core beliefs and the traits that I've identified here, and this pragmatic Anglo-European typology, is that English identity is compatible with British and European identities all at one time. Similarly, identity should be inclusive. The UK and England are a part of Europe by geography, history, and culture. So it's not just an objective reality in the sense that you can observe it on a map, but it's more so to do with history and culture, shared beliefs, values, and more abstract or ideational things. The EU is a worthwhile political project, so obviously a pragmatic Anglo-European would think that, but they see the EU more in instrumentalist terms, because although there is compatibilities in terms of history and culture, the EU as a political project was mainly about economics and about having a greater stance on the world. And finally, political devolution would benefit England. This is somewhat interesting and kind of falls outside the other points I've made, but I think this is more just about being representative and more broadly with regards to English politics. So moving forward, I think identity is an influential factor in contemporary politics that requires greater research. The pragmatic Anglo-European is just one example of many possible identity combinations that could be uncovered in post-Brexit England. Young people have the potential to shape future relationships between the home nations within the UK and between the UK and the EU. And it is likely that different worldviews exist within the 4 home nations, which again feeds back into what we're discussing here today. So thank you. I know it's been short.
Thank you. It would be interesting, but I suppose we're just getting started. Is this type which you just presented? I mean, how representative is he or she? I mean,
so I've actually done quite a bit of field work right now, and I haven't done any of the computing because I'm still trying to teach myself half of it, because I didn't even know what Q method was until my supervisors introduced me to it. But in terms of the qualitative aspects of it, a lot of people do identify pragmatically with the EU and wish they never left in the first place. With disdain on your face. But they viewed it more in instrumentalist terms, and they weren't really identifying as European. I find it quite interesting. A lot of the participants will say, I feel English, I am English, and the most agree, and I feel European somewhere in the middle. But then, do I want to rejoin the EU? They also have it in the most agree. So there's less of an emotional thing, which needs to be built, I think, by the European project. There needs to be, I mean, almost a recalibration towards, I don't know, encouraging more Schengen movement, things like that. Or what was the program that students had options in for visiting other institutions? Erasmus, so that as well. Things like that to build a cultural affiliation, I think is more important.
Well, I don't want to take too much of your time, but just one quick point. I think it's sort of, as somebody who comes from the EU and from the continent, I think one thing, because you said, this instrumentalist view of the EU, there's this very typically British, and there's, this whole of idea, we're the pragmatists and you're the sort of ideologues. And can I just say that I think for decades, there has been a tendency on the British side to completely overplay this contrast between these two attitudes.
Hugely,
and that actually lots of, sort of when you talk about sort of general population, there is a very broad consensus in a country like Germany that the EU is a good thing, that, I mean, Brexit is not a thing apart from the far right. But still, I think very often the British suspect that we have this huge emotional connection with it, and you're just very sort of, we just pick what suits us. I actually think you sometimes underestimate how ruthlessly pragmatic people like the French or indeed the Germans are about this. And so this might be just as context, might be interesting. But thank you so much. And next we have Baroness Julie Smith, who's a lecturer at Cambridge.
Thank you. It does feel a bit like we've got to the point when everything may have been said, but not everybody's said it. And I realise that I am now the 5th speaker, or at least, yeah, 5th, after, because we've had Connor online. And what I would say to John is, what a great idea to have somebody assisting with the statistical, quantitative background. And when you've finished using Connor's services, please can I borrow him? That there was a suggestion that we were all giving papers this morning. And I think what we've got is one very full paper and one very clear exploration of a PhD thesis. And then, if Nick will forgive me, Nick and I are giving slightly more anecdotal responses. I do not claim to have a paper. And my role in Cambridge is as Professor of European Politics. I suddenly thought last week, having forgotten about this workshop, I'd cancelled everything in London because the elections meant that everything was cancelled. And then Tim sent the message saying, we're looking forward to seeing you next week. And I looked again at the programme and thought, did I really agree to speak in that panel about England in the world? What on earth possessed me? So I had to go away and think a little bit about what I was going to say. And I was reminded of a presentation I did a few weeks ago at Russi for the Icelandic embassy. The Icelandic president had come and wanted a British perspective on the High North. And it was British, not English. But the chair wanted to know, what sort of perspective are we going to have? Is it really going to be a British perspective, or is it going to be the Liberal Democrat perspective? So I said, well, on this occasion, as I'm the only Brit on the panel, I thought it should probably be a British perspective. But I think that does highlight the issue that we've been exploring this morning, of whether there really is a British perspective on foreign policy, or whether there is an English perspective, whether I, as somebody who has spent the majority of my life in the southeast of England, would now count just as English. If you listen to me, you probably just think, well, that is an English woman speaking, and might make certain assumptions about my identities. But I realised a few years ago, when I went back to the university's language centre, feeling that my modern foreign languages had got a little bit rusty, that there was a word that I didn't know. And that was, so I'd gone back to refresh my German, and I wanted to say that I was British. And because I was being encouraged to say Engländerin, English. And I realised subsequently that when I was at school, when I was a young person spending time in Germany, I was obviously just quite happy to say I'm English, because the whole discussion of British versus English hadn't really become a thing. And suddenly, when I went on a French exchange, I was English, Anglaise. And my French friend's sister said, well, her father-in-law was going to be visiting. She was going to tell him that I was Irish, because he remembered the Second World War and he wasn't very happy with what the English had done. So she was going to rebrand me as Irish. Well, most of my ancestors were Irish, and I'm a Catholic. So I come to international and European politics very much with a sense of the international. I don't consider myself a pragmatic English European. I consider myself a rather federalist British European, and I find it quite difficult to have my own identity dissected. But I have to admit that if you press me, are you Scottish, English, Irish, then I have to say I'm English. But I spend much of my time trying to work on the United Kingdom's relations with the European Union. But wearing my political hat, I speak for the Liberal Democrats on defence. Defence and foreign policy are reserved competences, to use not quite the language we'd really use in the UK. But in terms of why we would be looking to Westminster for the policy, it is precisely because foreign policy and defence are retained policies. So when David Cameron is going around the world, he is actually speaking on behalf of the United Kingdom. And yet, if you go to Brussels, you will see that the Scottish Government has representation in Brussels. And there is a very clear sense in which the Scottish Government, in place since 1999, has increasingly sought to play an international role. And I think that is something that we don't necessarily talk about. And if you listen to questions in Parliament, particularly in the House of Lords, where the SNP have no representation, you get unionists on both sides, Labour and Conservative, who will be asking, by what right is the SNP, is the Scottish Government going and presenting itself as a separate international actor? But that is something that we've seen over the years. So 25 years ago, I became head of the European programme at Chatham House. And one of the pieces of work we were doing was looking at regional cooperation in Europe, where at that point we were probably talking about Scotland as a region rather than necessarily calling it a nation. But one of the things that Scotland was keen to do, well before the independence referendum of 2014, was looking at who were the other entities, regions that we might talk to. So Bavaria and Germany as a strong player. But over the years, Scotland has increasingly looked to Denmark and Ireland, two of the three new members in 1973, alongside the United Kingdom, both of which can say we've actually benefited from membership of the European Union. And what you've got with the Irish case in particular is a country that was always subservient to the United Kingdom, in its shadow, now able to have a seat at the table. And gradually, through the 1980s and 1990s, you would see successive Irish Taoiseachs having a role internationally, which no Scottish First Minister can have. So what we have, I think, are some Scottish perspectives that are different from those in London, but a sense of aspiration that if small member states can play a significant role in Europe, why couldn't Scotland not look like that? So there may be a pragmatism to that. It's not just saying we want to be in Europe because we benefit from the trade, but also because Scotland potentially could play a significant role, ideally as an independent state. So you can see a reason why being more Scottish than British in the context of that data makes sense. Because if you were European, if you were Scottish, if you voted voted no in 2014 because you'd been persuaded that that was the only way to stay in Europe, then by 2016, having seen the changes, you might now be saying, well, actually, where are we? Where does Scotland fit? And for many people, there is that identity of being Scottish and European, and the prospect potentially of independence in Europe. But so I think there are differences, but I think the other point that I want to make, and then I'll shut up because I realise that people will want to ask questions, is that what we've got, I think, in the United Kingdom is a sense in which the UK has played on its traditional sense of being a large country and forgotten the line from Diana Panker that in the European Union, and obviously until recently the UK was in the European Union, that there are two sorts of states: small states and states that haven't yet realised that they are small states. Germany and France might wish to differ, but the United Kingdom, outside of the European Union, is at the very most a medium-sized state, and it's one that needs to look again at its alliances. And that's something that was touched on in some of the data, but I think is also something where we see a difference between political parties, that traditionally we've seen the two main parties going back and forth about whether they felt that membership of the European Union was a good thing or not a good thing. We now have the situation of being outside the European Union and no prospect in the short term of rejoining the European Union. So for the young, pragmatic Anglo-Europeans, there may be a prospect of future membership. But at the moment, what does the UK need to do? It needs to rebuild alliances. And what we're beginning to see is that the Conservative government that's been in place, particularly under Rishi Sunak, has begun to try and strengthen some alliances. Yeah. But it's partly on an ad hoc basis. And I'm trying to find out whether there's really a strategy. AUKUS, as you can see, that there's a global perspective, there's a concern about China. But then we have links with Japan and Italy over fast jets. So there's a bit of cherry picking, but nevertheless some understanding of the importance of alliances. The Labour Party, assuming that it's about to take office on the 5th of July, is talking in many ways a language that looks quite similar to what the Conservatives have been saying in terms of foreign policy, defence, and not wanting to look as if they differ in order not to frighten the horses. But if you look closely at what David Lammy's been saying, there is a suggestion about looking for a stronger UK-EU security relationship, that the time has come for that. So I think for the two main British Unionist parties, there is an understanding now that the UK needs to be thinking about alliances. And in many ways, that puts it exactly on the same page as the SNP in Scotland, which realised perhaps rather sooner that we need to have strong alliances. But in order to do that, one of the things that we need to do, particularly from Westminster and Whitehall, is rebuild trust, that there needs to be a way in which other countries will look at the United Kingdom and say, yes, we really can work with you, and we believe that you're going to uphold the things that you have said you stand for. And that is something that the whole Brexit vote and the nature of the negotiations from 2017 through to 2020 puts us in a very difficult position, but I think we're beginning to see a more nuanced position now. And with that, I should stop.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. Before I sort of take questions, I'm just going to abuse my position to say two things. One thing you said in the beginning is quite important to me. When you gave your paper and said about, you asked people what your identity is. My first thought was, I'm not sure I have one. Ooh. In the sense that I have a passport, I have opinions, I speak certain languages, I have certain friends, I have certain values. But I would not say that I have some kind of, these things, I don't even think about what is my identity. It's not a question I've ever have asked myself, to define it as like one thing. Mm-hmm. And I also wouldn't say that all these things sort of, what is my essence? And my essence then defines how I vote, for example. And it is, and I'm just saying, when you said identity is worth doing more research on, I'm not saying that's not true, but I am pointing out that the fact that we study these questions actually reinforce everybody's interest in. So, you know, if you've never asked me, do you feel more German or European, I might have never have thought about it, but now that every politician around me suddenly is talking about identity, I might start thinking or feeling more strongly. So I'm just saying that this is a sort of self, and I think this is also true when it comes to the United Kingdom question of Britishness or Englishness, as you said.
Except
yes.
the Eurobarometer polls for 50
yes.
years have asked questions of, do you feel more British, European, and so on.
Yes.
So not necessarily the subnational, but also in Germany there are questions, you know, are people more Bavarian than German than European. So
All I'm saying is how much does, it's a question you point out, how much, you might have, if pressed, you might have an answer, but how important is that question to you?
If we
Just worth bearing in mind.
When I would say on that, if we look at studies that are not primarily about identity, like the more in common segmentation study that's used a lot in the elections, but you look within that, you find there's about 10 to 12% of the population who genuinely, not necessarily don't have an identity, but don't invest it in any importance.
Well, that's my point.
But,
yeah.
but you've also got about 90% of the population who feel their identities very strongly, but also associate a great deal of pride with them. So the sort of non-identity identity is undoubtedly a thing, but it is not typical of most people's attitudes to national identity. I mean, the non-identity bit, I'm not putting you in a category, but tends to be the graduate liberal cosmopolitan. And they tend to be the people who say, well, it doesn't matter to me. And to the extent that they sort of dominate three of our major political parties, it suggests why sometimes they're out of touch with the electorate as a whole.
And
and then we get Nigel Farage.
Yeah, I was going to add as well that the post-functionalist logic, which I was referencing before, dictates that when there is an increase in things like immigration and whatnot, you become more self-aware of identity because your norm is then
You're
being
more
quote-unquote
confronted
threatened.
with
It's more,
differences,
it's more observed differences, and because of that, you become maybe scared or accustomed to it, whatever like direction you take, right? But interestingly, with the Brexit vote and the outcomes in terms of the regional distributions, it actually was regions that had less immigration that voted more strongly for Brexit.
Yes.
That's because they were scared of the unknown, but that
Same
makes them
with
more
the far
aware of
right
their
in Germany,
personal
by the
selves.
way.
Yeah. So I think non-identity is in itself an identity. You can never be truly non-identified because it's always relative, right? So that's my response, I would say.
Well, great. So shall we take some questions on all the papers? Yeah.
Thanks. First, I want to apologise. I'm going to go in about 10 minutes to go to Italy, so I'll apologise.
That's a good excuse.
My question follows on neatly from what's just been being discussed, because the kind of stuff I do and what John was presenting is very much in that spirit, is that we imagine that identity kind of comes first, and from that follow constitutional preferences and electoral preferences and so on. But then obviously we discover on the cases like the Scottish referendum and the EU referendum that it changes identities. And so now one way of interpreting that is that this feedback is from identity to politics, but from politics to identity. But it feels to me like the kind of identity or the kind of identity survey response that can follow from, say, a referendum is different. I wouldn't go around saying, well, now they've changed that, that could change everything going forward, because the kind of stuff we're used to changing is actually the stuff that's causally prior. So what I really want to know is, what should we call the two types of identity that we've got? The one that we've been working with all along, that is deep and comes first and did the driving, as opposed to the one that is generated by politics, for want of a better way of putting it. How can we call that second type, and is it as kind of almost ephemeral as I'm beginning to sound like I'm suggesting?
Well, do any of you want to?
I mean, I would have let me hazard a couple of things. Well, it's good to see you. I came to the room and I thought, no, you're in Pisa, but you're not yet in Pisa. Firstly, and this complicates things, but the identity categories we've got, British or English, I'm increasingly thinking confuse as much as they elucidate. Not least because, for example, most of the people who said I'm English more than I'm British, who voted Leave, when you ask them about their Britishness, they're very strongly British and they're very patriotically British. So it is a very English thing. So what you find, say, take Britishness, it comes in a form that is very strongly associated with a very strong Englishness and a desire to see an English Parliament, not be in the EU. But it is also the primary identity of those liberal cosmopolitan graduates I'm talking about. So what you find is that Britishness in England, firstly, comes in many different forms, and secondly, is quite different to the Britishness you'll find in Scotland or Wales. So it's not this idea we used to have that English identity was about England and British identity was a shared identity across the United Kingdom, has long ceased to be the case. So that's the first point, so the categories get in the way. The second thing I would say, and I've published some stuff on this based on the 20 years up to 2019, is there are things that are associated with people's identities that are only occasionally mobilised. So in other words, Brexit really mobilised two really important things. One is that English or English and British sense of sovereignty, and the second thing was the dislike of immigration or fears about immigration. If you'd never posed it as a binary choice where those are the only issues on the ballot paper, you might never have had the 2019 election, which was an overwhelmingly English mandate for Boris Johnson because it was about get Brexit done and the rest of it. So I don't think it's ephemeral, I think it's real, but it's only occasionally mobilised. And if I went to the latest thing on the opinion polls and looking at the election campaign, there's a group of voters who are passionately concerned about small boats and don't want to do anything about climate change. And I'm talking about England here. There's a group of voters who passionately want to do stuff about climate change and aren't bothered about small boats. Why is that not really appearing in the election campaign, apart from in Clapton and the Reform Party? It's because everybody is more concerned about the cost of living, and everybody's more concerned with the National Health Service.
Yeah.
So it's not ephemeral in the sense that it's there, but it's nowhere near the top of people's lists. But the interesting question is, could events happen that suddenly switch that around again, which is really what happened around the Brexit referendum.
Can I just say, events is one thing, but isn't also political rhetoric and sort of sloganeering and discourse another thing? I mean, if you sort of whip people up in a certain direction, doesn't that have consequences in mobilizing these positions?
So you can't mobilise something that's not there.
No, I said it's there, but you said it's
not
necessarily always mobilised. But it's not just what happens; it's also what you say.
Yeah, absolutely. On my very rushed list.
Sorry.
So my rushed list of events was disruptive political parties.
Yeah. Okay.
So in other words,
okay,
without UKIP starting off in Euro elections and then winning council seats, there never would have been a Conservative offer of a referendum, there never would have been Brexit. So if you don't have a disruptive political actor, the views are there. You haven't created the views, but they have to be expressed. Absolutely, absolutely central.
Then we're same.
Central. Yeah, we're
On the
same
same
place.
page.
Yes. Yeah.
Good. Anybody else?
Can I ask a question about class and ethnicity? So, John, you talked about age being a key factor. To what extent does class still matter in terms of people identifying with either English or British? And to what extent does ethnicity matter? Because it used to be that if you were white, you were more likely to identify with English, whereas if you were non-white, you were more likely to identify with British. Just Nick, your sample, how does that feed in? As you go to talk to these working class young people, you're going to talk to those from different ethnic backgrounds.
So I have not accounted for demographic data because that was beyond the remit of the PhD, according to my supervisors. So all the data I've compiled so far is anonymized, and it's just about the more broadly held beliefs as a snapshot. And then, I mean, if anyone's offering postdocs, please take me on, and I'll incorporate demographic factors. And then, in terms of catchment areas in the university, so all the interviews of the Q method respondents I'm conducting are at the institutions across the English 9 former EU parliamentary constituencies, and I'm looking at catchment areas of institutions. Broadly speaking, it's just to be somewhat representative, but it's not going to be entirely representative, so I can't really speak too much to that.
So it's mainly university students?
Yeah, and I'm also going to vocational colleges as well, just to incorporate, because there's certain class associations and stuff with different institutional types, yeah.
And just on the data point, on the ethnicity thing, there's a real shift in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, but it's an incomplete process. So both English and British were both historically seen as white identities. Okay, British multiculturalism started, never was an English multiculturalism, very different to Wales and Scotland, which built national inclusive projects. So Englishness has trailed behind Britishness in inclusivity. Where we are, latest polling done a couple of years ago, Most people in England no longer regard English as a white identity. Most white people don't, and that's a very significant change in attitude. However, whilst most people in ethnic minorities say, I could be English, they have not yet signed on the form, if you like, done the deal. And that's partly because outside of sport, ethnic minorities are rarely represented as English. They're usually represented as British. So it's sort of moving in an inclusive direction. But what we don't know, unless somebody else has got it, is how that relates to the sorts of issues we're talking about here. And the trouble with the sort of YouGov polling is, and it's notorious, is their panels on ethnic minorities, but particularly on new minorities, new migrants, are very weak, because who signs up to an online polling thing, so however you try to do it. What we know, for example, is that more ethnic minorities voted Brexit than people would have assumed, and there was a very big play by Leave for ethnic minority voters, on the basis that freedom of movement within the EU was a white policy, and that it actually was discriminating against people coming in from outside the EU.
Yes. You'll be able to bring your family members in much more easily once we've left, despite the fact that the number of third country migrants coming in was already about double, you know, if not more, the number.
Although it did turn out they were going to let in far more people from outside the EU. And any of us were doing the Leave campaign promising all the time.
And then you think of the Breaking Point poster, and it all seems a bit contradictory. Maybe, is there any other,
Thinking about Scottish independence and looking at the data, what would you say there's any generalisations can be made about the shape of a Scottish foreign policy? You mentioned the nuclear issue, for example, or is there in fact what you found as big a spread, if you like, a variation of attitude within Scotland, as you might suggest there is in England?
I would hesitate to draw generalisations. And the Leave Remain stuff was quite clear, but of course there were far fewer Leavers in Scotland, so you can't equate the two. I would guess there probably is I'll have a look back at the numbers, a larger group of people who would be anti-nuclear, pro-EU, pro-action on climate change. So you could see, I think, and Rob may have a view on this, the elements of a broadly progressive Scottish foreign policy in those terms. Whether that can find expression when the practical difficulties of Scottish independence have got higher since Brexit, I don't know.
Particularly the nuclear issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really an expert. I find it fascinating, somebody's done all his politics in England, that the SNP can be an anti-nuclear party, and it appears never to have caused them any problems at all.
I was just in Scotland to do research on, a chapter of my book which is supposed to be on the future of the Union, and I interviewed politicians from all different parties represented in the Scottish Parliament, and it was really fascinating because you talk to a Scottish nationalist and he tells you that we want to stay sort of as an independent Scotland, we want to join NATO, that's the new line now, we want to join the EU but also NATO, so we want to get rid of the nuclear weapons, but we want to be in NATO, and that's not a contradiction because there are plenty of countries in NATO who don't have nuclear weapons. And okay, fair enough. And they very much emphasize their progressiveness, and that Scottish nationalism is not right-wing, is not nationalist, is not blood and soil anymore, it's very much sort of social justice. Okay, I do that interview, go 2 doors down and talk to somebody from a different party, which is well, he spoke to me on the record, might as well tell you, so this was a Lib Dem. And he said, well, the SNP is the only party in Europe which has managed, which is fundamentally a right-wing nationalist party, managing to pull off the big sort of trick and disguising themselves as liberal progressive people, and everybody's buying this. I have yet to make my own, I don't have an opinion yet, so I'm just pointing out this contradiction because it is at least a justified question to ask how a nationalist party can at the same time, and I think this is because I think over the last few decades Scottish nationalism very much took that road towards saying or our social problems, very profound social problems that we have here in Scotland, are due to the fact that we are not free, and that independence would mean that we could tailor our own economic policy, social policy to Scottish problems. I'm just repeating what people tell me, I'm not saying I agree. And this is how independence is not sort of, and then also they hate the comparison between, which as a sort of European observer, the comparison between Brexit and Scottish independence.
Yeah. Well, the Brexiteers
They
hate it as
loathe
well.
this,
Yeah.
and they say no, the difference is Brexit is a right-wing thing, and Scottish nationalism is a progressive, sort of soft left thing. I'm just leaving that there, and I'm also going to talk about it in my paper. But
Can I just make a slightly related point about how things find political expression?
Yes.
Because Julie made the point quite rightly that defence and foreign policy is reserved to the UK government.
Mm.
But the UK government is structured in a way that does not delineate a UK interest from the English interest.
Yep.
And so we have a structure of internal politics where it will always be possible for people in Scotland or in Wales or in Northern Ireland, and that's been the most obvious in the last year or two, to say this UK government is representing England's point of view, but it's hidden because England dominates the UK government. And one of the interesting things, I think, will be if there is a change in the election and David Lammy, who's a good friend of mine, a Londoner, black, absolutely clear that he's English, famous interview on LBC when he was talking about this, whether David's perspective on life is actually UK.
Yes.
Or whether his political experience is actually deeply in England, and that would come out as UK foreign policy. So I think when you talk about Scotland being represented internationally, one of the weaknesses in the way we do our territorial politics is that England's interests are hidden, but are dominant.
And one of the things that happened in the wake of the referendum was the fact that the government was in London was reluctant to use the intergovernmental mechanisms that could have been used and should have been used, and said no, fisheries shouldn't be repatriated to Scotland because and actually there were ways in which the internal politics of the UK were damaged precisely in the way the powers were repatriated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think we have 4 minutes left. So is there a final question, or do any of you want to sum up some final points? Otherwise, we can have lunch. Well, thank you all very much. I think there's much more to discuss. I think the point you made about also foreign policy, and that's a general point which is really interesting about foreign policy and minorities. I think not just in the United Kingdom, what we're seeing at the moment all over, I would say, the Western world, is that the distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy, this is becoming much more blurry, and that also has to do with defense and the changing nature of war, in the sense, and questions like national resilience, and it's no longer, war and peace are not strictly binary. It's no longer just crossing a border with a tank. It's also hacking the NHS, for example, or so. At times like this, when you don't have a war, but also you don't really have security, and foreign and domestic things sort of are hard to distinguish. And then you have politicians who might use foreign policy to make domestic points, and they're doing that everywhere. And without getting into the details of Israel and Gaza, I mean, we see this all over Europe. We've seen it in America, how honestly the debate in these different countries about this issue has actually precious little to do with what is happening on the ground in the Middle East, and very much to do with the domestic sort of different grievances or opinions, or politicians also reacting to how people feel about this. So I think this is not a uniquely British phenomenon, but it's maybe worth thinking about. So I thought that was a really important point. Anyway, thank you all very much, and then we'll reconvene at 1.
Yes, 1 o'clock, yes. So lunch is just outside. Yes, we will start on.
No, it's